Guest for you today. I'd like to talk just for a second. Miss Charmaine has been trying to help us create a connection with Crossville for the main campus so that we can get you guys plugged into some of our missions trips that we're doing. So a lot of those come and go and we don't hear about them as much. So we're trying to fix problems while we're young and new and fix them as we come on up. Come on up, Miss Charmaine. Grab one of those microphones over there. I'm sorry. When she's up, and when she's down, she's down. But anyway, she's going to talk to you about that, the issue of getting connected with our missions here. We want you guys to take a part in that. As we fulfill the Great Commission, we want to help you get into local missions as well as out into all the world. So Charmaine, tell them a little bit about that, and then a special project that we're also working on for this winter.
Okay, so we are connecting as much as possible with the Crossville campus for our mission trips. I have on the table out here, I set up a missions table. It has the 2025 schedule for all the mission trips. I'm trying to get everybody interested. And we actually may do a mission trip of our own just for our church. So we're working on that as well. That may be to Costa Rica, actually. I have a little bit more information about that this week. Locally, we are doing a community coat drive for a local neighborhood here in Pikeville for kids that need coats in the winter. So if you see me at the table out there, you can grab one of these cards. They will say the kid's name, coat size. I need them to be back to me by September 22nd, that's Sunday. Also at the bottom of the card, you can write a note to the child that you're giving the coat to, which I thought would be really cool. So that's pretty much it. If you have any questions, just see me at the table after service.
But I asked Charmaine to come up and join us today so that you guys that don't know her will get to know her. And then if you have questions about a missions trip that you're interested in, or you start thinking about that, you can send your questions to Miss Charmaine.
And even if you come up with an idea, like God lays something on your heart for a trip that we don't currently do, let me know. And we can kind of see if we can put that together and maybe have us go. Okay? Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Charmaine. All right. Again, thank you for coming back. I'm surprised. I figured after I preached last time there would be nobody back. But I appreciate you coming back, and I look forward to us getting back in the boat with Jonah this morning. That's my dad joke for the day. But for those of you that weren't here last week, I just want to do a quick recap of where we're at with Jonah. So we know that Jonah was a prophet of the Lord, and we know that Jonah had done some other things for the Lord that we read about in other references in the Old Testament. But the book of Jonah starts off with it saying, "And the word of the Lord came to Jonah." And we see that he told them to go to the Assyrians in Nineveh, which was a large city. And he told them to make sure that they know that God sees what they're doing and that he's going to hold them accountable and can bring their downfall. So Jonah hears this message from the Lord and decides he's going to run. So he goes to Tarshish, or gets on a ship headed to Tarshish. He goes down to Joppa, gets a ticket on a boat heading to Tarshish. And we talked about that being an established trade route. We're going to talk a lot more about that today because I think it's significant as we get into this, as we get more into this story. But Bill, put the picture up of the Sunday school class stuff. Yeah. So one of the things that I wanted to point out, I mentioned this last week, but I wanted to find a picture of a good flannel graph presentation of the story of Jonah. This is, if you went to church as a child, you saw this story. Let's break this picture down. We have little introverted Jonah, and we have Nineveh with no heads, feet, ears, or noses laying around like we talked about last week, and how brutal they were. We have this cute little bathtub boat and one little cloud with one little lightning bolt. Now that's great if we're introducing this story to little children. But this story is much more important than just a child's bedtime story or a Sunday school story. And so I think it's important, and I want you to understand why we do this, because today we're going to make a connection between Jonah and the world he was living in and the modern American church today. So we'll go ahead and get to verse number 4. Verse 4. It said, "Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up." Now, here again, we see this word, great. We used it earlier in an earlier verse when he said the great city of Nineveh. That is not the same great as we would say, it's a great day. Good luck to you. We're having a great day over here. That's not what it is. It's talking about how massive it is. It's the same Hebrew word that's used in Genesis when we talk about the sun and the moon being placed in the sky and the great lights that the Lord established. So it's very important that you understand that the Lord took this great supernatural hurricane, formed it in his hand, and it says that he sent it, or in the Hebrew word there again is better translated, he hurled it. Think about that. Supernatural storm hurled by God at you. Think about that. That's what happened. And that's what we see happening right here. And it's caused such a violent storm that the ship threatened to break up. Now, this is where we're going to talk about the ship a little bit more. So I want to spend a second talking about the ship. Now, remember, we're heading to Tarshish. And we'll go ahead and throw that map up, Bill. We're going to throw the map up of the area and the terrain and where we're headed. So here again. So down here in the bottom right-hand corner, you see Joppa. So Jonah went down to Joppa and got a ticket in a boat to go to Tarshish, which is on the southern tip of Spain. That is 2,500 miles away. Now, God had told him to go to Nineveh. Nineveh was 500 miles away. So he went 2,000 more miles on the water to get away and flee from God. That's the significance of that. However, let's talk about the boat. So there was a whole class of boat in the ancient world called the Tarshish ship. It was named after the port. And it was an interesting boat because it was the freighter of the ancient world. It was about 100 feet long. And if you want to get an idea of how long 100 feet is, if you go from this back wall to that wall on the other side of the lab, that's 100 feet. So the lab is 100 feet wide. So this was a really long boat in the ancient world. This would have been considered the biggest boat on the ocean. And it was very wide and it was built very strong. This boat was designed to carry very valuable and very heavy cargo, like gold. So this was not a ship that was built to sink easily. This was the Titanic of its day. It was, which they said they wouldn't sink. But they had this ability to do this. And we look over at Ezekiel 27:25, if you have your Bible with you. Ezekiel kind of parallels this story, not about Jonah, but about the area that we see in the trade that's going on in the Mediterranean region during this time. So it's really important. Now and we're talking about 3,000 years ago, so we're within 100 years or so of Jonah in this passage of Ezekiel. But in Ezekiel 27:25, he says, "The ships of Tarshish serve as the carriers of your wares. You are filled with heavy cargo as they sail the sea." So even over in the other place in the Bible, in Ezekiel, we see where the Lord talks about this ship and the significance of this massive ship. Now, if we go on here, and it's going to break up. So this storm was bad enough to make this ship want to break up. The next verse is very important too. Verse 5, it says, "All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God." Now, you have to understand, the Tarshish ships of the day, and this is biblical record, this is also in other parts of history, these were the most skilled sailors of the day. These were not just guys that were looking for some extra work and got a job on a ship. These were very skilled sailors, and they knew the Mediterranean. They knew the fact of which way the winds blew, because one of the things, Bill, would you go back to the map? And I'm sorry, I'm going to give you carpal tunnel jumping around here. But one of the things we know about the Mediterranean is that when they left Joppa, they had to travel counterclockwise, the way the winds blew around the Mediterranean. So they would come along under Italy there and under Spain, and then they would come back along the coast of Africa, back through by Egypt, and then back to Joppa. So that was the route. Now, I just was curious how long it would take to make that trip. So I found, and you can find this online, there is a sailing calculator that if you know the speed of the boat and the distance you need to go, you can kind of figure out how long it's going to take you to get there. So I did some research and I found out what the average speed of an ancient freighter was. It's one of these big ships, and it was 3 knots when it was loaded. So 3 knots is the speed, and when you put that into the calculator, it took them 35 days if they didn't stop. Uninterrupted sailing to go 2,500 miles, 35 days along that route. Now, the reality is, though, they had to stop at ports all along the way, and we're going to read about that in a minute. But they'd come all the way around and down through Africa, stopping at different ports. Now, Ezekiel also talks about the sailors that were there. So if we go back to Ezekiel 27:8, it said, "Men of Sidon and Arvad were your oarsmen, your skilled men, Tyre, were aboard as your sailors." So your skilled men. So it backs up that concept that these were guys who understood how these routes went. They had been on the seas for years. They had seen storms. They knew how to react to them. They knew how to turn the boats and how to get to port if they saw a storm. And so it's very significant when we see this, and it says, all of the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. Now that also speaks to the fact that we're talking about an international group of sailors. This is the best sailors from around the world. So they all had different gods, spoke different languages, and they worked together around this region in order to get these boats to where they needed to be and get this valuable cargo to where it needed to be. Now, there's also something that we see in Ezekiel that talks about this, that tells us that it wasn't just sailors on this boat. So, and I'm going to get to the point of this in a minute. You may think, why in the world are we spending so much time talking about the economy, about the demographics of the people who are on this boat, and those sorts of things? But I trust me, the Lord has something really cool in this story about this. So just bear with me. Now, so we know that there were oarsmen. We saw that in that other passage there. And it was very common on this boat. And we see later on in the story of Jonah where they tried to row the boat back to shore. So we know there were oarsmen on this boat. Now, they were a different group. They weren't the sailors, but they stayed below deck and they rowed that boat. When the sailors saw shallow water or coral reef, they could redirect it and get them into safe passage. So that was the role of the oarsmen. There was also soldiers, because we're going to read in a minute about all the crazy stuff that was on this boat. I mean, there was some valuable things on this boat. And so they had, anytime you have a boat and you have valuable cargo, what are you going to have? Pirates. I heard somebody say it. Very good, you're going to have pirates. So they had to have soldiers on here to guard these things. They also had shipwrights. The Bible talks about shipwrights. And a shipwright was somebody who stayed on the ship so that if this valuable cargo and this valuable ship started to leak or started to have damage, the shipwright could immediately go and fix that. They had all of the tools and the extra lumber and the stuff that they needed to get this boat right, because they couldn't take a chance on this stuff sinking. But it says that they all cried out to their own God. So these were people from all different religions. They had worshiped different gods, and they were horrified. This was a bad enough storm that they were terrified. And you know how terrified they are because of this next line. We see it says, "And they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship." That would not happen unless imminent death was at hand. You think about it. You are carrying a load of emeralds and rubies from Egypt, and you're taking them to buy something in Tarshish and trade for that. and you're going to do that, and you tell me that you threw that over the boat, you threw that into the sea, the whole trip's for nothing. But that's what they did. And we're going to look a little bit more at this cargo, because I think this is an important point. And if you look at the book of Ezekiel 27, and I'm not going to read the whole book, I've just broken down the different things that, and even some of them. There's other towns and cities that are on here that I didn't list. But we have on this boat, we could potentially have from Egypt. We had fine linens that were used to make the sails for these boats that they needed for shipbuilding somewhere else. And so they took these linens and for clothing and everything. I mean, textiles are tremendously valuable. We've minimized it now because we have such easy access to textiles and fabric. But this was a valuable thing in the ancient world. In Greece, there were slaves and bronze. So Greece would trade in slaves and bronze. And that was another group of folks that probably could have easily been on this ship. Now, the Bible doesn't say, but we could have had slaves on this ship as well as part of the cargo. And then there's a place called Beth Tagarna. And this was where they raised fine horses for chariots and mules for pulling loads. And so this boat may have had horses and mules and chariots that went along with them for warfare. That the very chariots that the Egyptians years ago may have used to chase down the children of Israel. You know, those chariots had to be made somewhere. So we're living in a time where these chariots are being manufactured and the horses are being trained to pull them. On the west coast of Africa, we see ivory tusks and ebony in this trade route. In Aram, which is modern-day Syria, we see rubies and fine fabrics. In Damascus, there is wine and wool and iron. Arabia, we have livestock of goats and sheep and all of these things for food to people and breeding stock all over the known world. And then the most southern point that they went to down in Africa was in Sheba, which is modern-day Ethiopia. That's where a lot of historians think this was. But there were fine spices and gold and fine rugs and precious stones. So I say all this to say that this is a tremendously valuable cargo. And when this storm hits, they just throw it overboard because that's how bad this storm was. It gets me to wondering how many people were affected by this. Have you ever thought about the storm? If it was a hurricane of massive supernatural strength, what effect did it have on the other ships around them? The other ports? We've seen in some of the hurricanes that we've seen, and some of you folks that are from Florida, you see how that can shut down the local economy, how our gas prices rise here every time there's a hurricane in the Gulf Coast. And because of the disruption of the supply chain. And if nothing else, we saw during COVID how the disruption of the supply chain can affect us. Would you ever have thought in your lifetime you would have had trouble finding toilet paper? We lived through that just a few years ago. So we can see the disruption of this supply chain. And it all happened. And it was all happening because of one man's sin. Let me ask you a question. When you sin, and you sin in secret, and no one knows what you do, does it only affect you? How many people had mortgaged their homes, had put their own freedom on the line, and were going to end up going into servitude as a slave because of this storm and the damage and the lost cargo? Folks, one of the things that I want to point out to you today, you do not sin in isolation. You do not sin in isolation. When you sin, you affect your children. When you sin, you affect your parents. When you sin, you affect your brothers and sisters. your grandchildren, your grandparents. When you sin, when you pursue that, remember what we talked about. Remember when we talked about the lion and how we're drawn into sin, how the devil takes a natural sin, a natural desire that we have for something, and he perverts it. And then that's the lust of the flesh. And then the lust of the eyes comes along, where we take and we see that thing that we think out there is going to satisfy that desire. And we pursue that. But we stop. But then the pride of life kicks in and says, you deserve this. You've been through so much. It's all about you. You only hurt yourself. These are the things that we hear. But it's not true. Our sin affects everybody around us. And we have to understand that. If we want to have peace in the storm, and we want our families to have peace in the storm, we have to strive for a holy life. Now, are we going to be perfect all the time? Of course not. That's what grace is for. But we have to understand, and do not let the devil lie and say that you're only hurting yourself in that sin. Because there's people you don't even know who are going to pay for your sin. Now, you may be sitting here today and you may go, well, boy, I'm glad he's saying that. Praise the Lord, amen. Because I don't do drugs. I'm not having affairs. But let me ask you this. What about the lust of comfort? What about the lust of convenience? You see, in churches all over today, every pew and every church, there's somebody sitting there that's really comfortable. We have to be careful as Americans, because it's so easy to say, boy, God has blessed us so much because of our faithfulness. We are such good Christians and so faithful. Look at how we're blessed. Look at how he's given us all these wonderful things. I had a missionary one time warn me that you can't say that. You have to be careful. And the reason why is because go tell that person in North Korea who's sneaking to have church, who's risking their lives and the lives of their family to read the Bible. I would like for you to explain to them how you're sacrificing for Jesus. Think about that. Think about that. We have no clue how good we have it, how easy we have it because of different political and God has blessed. I'm not negating that. I'm not minimizing that. But you can't go tell people in North Korea, Christians there, that you're sacrificing more than them, and therefore that's why you have more blessings than them. That's just not the case. The word of the Lord, and we build on last week, the word of the Lord has come to you. The word of the Lord has come to you. And the word of the Lord says, go into all the world and preach the gospel. In your town, in the next town over, everywhere you're at. But we get up in our climate-controlled room. We sit up out of our Tempur-Pedic bed, put on our little slippers. We go through the house, we touch one button, have a nice cup of coffee. We get ready, we get in our climate-controlled car, and we go to a climate-controlled church, putting on our nicest clothes. If the modern traditional church existed in the ancient world, I would make the argument they would be right with Jonah. And the reason I say that is this, because this would have been their plan. Let's get on the Lord said, go to Nineveh. We're leaving this, and I threw this picture up here because I want you to see, this is a time in history where around the Mediterranean, it was an economic boom. There was so much money to be made in this international travel that everybody, you could be sitting in Egypt and be eating olives from the mountains of Spain. You could be doing these things with this supply chain and all of this wealth and all of this comfort and all this convenience. Nineveh is very similar in the day to what we see today with North Korea. And I use North Korea as an example for that purpose because I think it's probably the closest thing to what they dealt with. If you've read anything about North Korea, you know their economy is not very good. Nobody wants to trade with them. They're scared of him. That guy's crazy. And so you look here at Nineveh out there. They did not have a lot of trading partners. Now they extorted people for stuff and they conquered people for stuff, but they were at a time in their empire where they were on the downturn. They weren't expanding as much and they were trying to hold on and all of these things, and they were still doing all of this wickedness. And we talked about how they were building temples similar to the Jews, and they were sacrificing babies and they were doing these horrible things and committing these terrible immoralities on the altar right in front of the Lord and throwing it up in his face. And it was squalor. And so Jonah's sitting here in this breadbasket of the Mediterranean, and he's being told that he needs to go reach the Ninevites. Now we don't know, and I'm adding some artistic license here, but I think Jonah, part of what he did was he just had a better plan than what God had. He thought, you know what, we'll use the trade route for us. Let's go to Tarshish. We'll build a big church. We'll have VBS. We'll have all these really great Sunday schools. We'll have a choir. Oh my goodness, the choir we will build will rival the angels of heaven. And we will have choir practice, and we will have 3 services a week, and we will send flyers to the Ninevites and try to get them to come to Tarshish and come to our Sunday school Bible study. That's the modern church strategy. That's what we're doing now. That's how we have perverted the Great Commission. We have made it about the Great Tradition and not the Great Commission. And if we don't fix it, people will pay. There are people who are dying and going to hell. There are children living in environments of broken homes because the gospel's not reaching their parents. And it's our fault. It is the fault of the church. Because we build a temple, we put a fortress around the temple, and we send out flyers inviting people into our temple. It's time we get the light out into the darkness. We'll get the band to come on back up. And Jonah and I think he was starting to get some concern, right? Because as we look at this next part, it says, verse 5, it says, but Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. Folks, the majority of the American church is asleep below deck. We are asleep below deck while the storm is raging and people's lives and livelihoods and their hopes and dreams and their potential are being trashed by this storms. And that storms of their own making, but what do we say? We look at them over there and we say, well, when they start helping themselves, we'll help them. But that's what we do. We're going to have to get dirty, church. We're going to have to get out. We're going to have to get our feet dirty. We're going to have to get our hands dirty. We're going to have to take the light out to the darkness. If we're not doing that, the people are going to pay for it. Now verse 6 says this, the captain went to him and said, how can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we will not perish. Isn't it sad that a pagan had to come to Jonah and say, how can you sleep in this storm? Folks, the churches are going to have to wake up. And I hope we're part of the leading that way. But it's not going to happen unless you do that. Don't wait for somebody to walk up to you and beg you to ask for, and start asking you about what's going on and why is this happening. Recognize it. See them. See the people who are hurting. Go out and help them. If we don't, and we don't share with them, it may be too late. Guys, as we lift up this worship, if this is something that has convicted you and you say, you know what? I'm not too far from Jonah. I'm not that much different from Jonah. I would choose the comfort of the Mediterranean over the danger and the discomfort of Nineveh. If that's you this morning, lay it before the Lord. Ask Him to forgive you. And let's get that light out into the darkness.